Tricia Thrasher obtained her Ph.D. from the Department of French and Italian at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in May 2022. Yes, 2022. She's currently the research manager and French program manager at Immerse, the first VR language learning platform that allows for real-time language teaching and learning. Her research interests include immersive technologies for language learning, foreign language anxiety, and oral production, and subjective and objective anxiety measurements. She has published in journals such as the Calico Journal and the Foreign Language Annals, and is currently the chair of the Calico Immersive Reality Special Interest Group. She also recently served as the co-editor of the Calico Journal special issue on XR and language learning. Tricia, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, y'all. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be spending this hour talking to all of you. So like she said, my name is Tricia Thrasher. I'm the research and French program manager at Immerse. And the title of my talk today is I Felt Less Pressure to Be Perfect, Using Social Virtual Reality Platforms for Second Language Speaking Practice. So I'm going to aim to talk for like 35-40 minutes. We'll leave time for Q&A. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. And if there are things that we need to clarify, I'm happy to do that before we continue on. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, my microphone was like barely moving, so I wanted to make sure. Yeah. So obviously the first thing I'm gonna do is give you a little introduction about me. So you kind of know who am I, why am I here talking to you about VR? And then also talk a little bit about kind of situate the project. So why was I working with VR to begin with? Then I'll define virtual reality just to make sure we're all on the same page about what that means. I'll give an overview of the VR platform that was used in this study, again, so you can kind of get a feel for like, what did it look like? What are the types of things that are possible to do with that platform? I'll talk specifically about what the students in this study did and give you the examples of like the task and kind of show how they were integrated into the course. And then talk about student feedback. So what did they like? What did they dislike? So that hopefully it can help you if you're going to be using this with your students. And then also I'm going to spend some time on like lessons learned, again, in the attempt to help you hopefully avoid some pitfalls that I learned when I was using VR for the first time. And then at the end, I'll give you a list of like resources. I have like a running list of pedagogical articles on VR that give really practical examples of how you can use it in your classroom. And then also I'll give you all the activities that students did as well, in case those can be helpful. So to get started, my experience with VR and language learning started back in September of 2018. I was in like a teaching languages with technology graduate seminar, and we went to a VR lab and I tested out Immerse Me. If you're familiar with that, it's a platform. It's essentially like a bunch of pre-recorded conversations in real life locations. And so the students go into VR or on their desktop computer for Immerse Me, they can do either. And they have like a dialogue back and forth with an AI. I guess it would be AI. Yeah. So it's like computer to human interaction. So that was kind of like my first exposure. And so I knew I wanted to do something with VR, but I had no experience at all. I'm also not like a gamer, so I don't have any background in that type of stuff. But I ended up doing a like initial pilot research study in spring of 2019. And you can see I kind of modeled that after what I saw in Immerse Me. So it was a 360 recorded video actually of me that my participants or students had to interact with in French. And I was looking at basically their anxiety doing this like in VR versus like in a face-to-face setting. And then throughout like from that point, from fall 2019 till now, I've conducted a lot of different research studies in these different types of social VR spaces. So the one that you see here, it's called vTime. That's one I'll be focusing on today because I use that for my dissertation work. But I've also done some studies in Immerse, some studies in spatial, if you're familiar with that platform, some things in like alt space. So kind of all over the place with that. And then I've also taught students in these platforms as well. A lot of times my research and teaching go hand in hand. So I've done kind of both. And then, yeah, I started as a research manager at Immerse back in February of 2022 and have just continued with VR since then. So that's a little bit about me. And now I want to give you a little introduction to the project just to like situate, why was I even looking at VR to begin with? So it all came from, I was mostly actually interested in foreign language anxiety. So the definition that is widely used in the field that everyone here has probably seen is that FLA is the worry and negative emotional reaction that comes about when learning or using a second language. And we know that it's detrimental to language learning, right? I mean, any language teacher has seen that from firsthand experience. And there's also been 3 meta-analyses alone conducted in the past 3 years, looking at like all the research that has shown, yes, it does indeed negatively impact ultimate achievement and proficiency, and that's particularly detrimental for speaking skills. And we also know, based on research, that it's greatly impacted by background. So things like age, gender, proficiency level, and also the learning environment itself. So that was actually where I started from. And I was interested in this, because I'm just very interested in foreign language anxiety, and also because our current students, which are Generation Z learners, are known to have higher anxiety than previous generations. So it was something that I was definitely wanting to improve. And so I started looking at, research on technology because I knew I wanted to do something with that, and kept finding a bunch of studies that had been conducted on virtual worlds like Second Life that kept finding that VR or that those types of environments were beneficial for foreign language anxiety for reducing it. But at the time, there still hadn't been really anything done on like high immersive virtual reality, because this was, like I said, back in like 2018, 2019. But the minimal research that had been done was showing that it does alleviate anxiety, and that this is largely due to avatars. So the fact that you're shielded from others, that you're anonymous, that there are like reduced social cues like eye contact, body language, all of that was found to be beneficial. But like I said, there wasn't a lot of research on like high immersion VR at the time. There was also a need to examine like how anxiety fluctuates throughout a task dynamically and also across these different environments. There was a huge lack of physiological data. So pretty much all the data was either like a self-reported questionnaire or like, qualitative feedback. So I wanted to look at things like heart rate and salivary cortisol to get kind of more of an objective measurement of anxiety. And then there was also still a need to provide evidence that VR does reduce anxiety and then also in turn like benefits learning. And I was looking specifically at oral production and pronunciation. So today I'm going to be focusing really on like the VR component of this, and showing you like from a practical standpoint what the students were doing and what they thought of it. I won't really be talking about the anxiety portion, but I wanted y'all to know kind of like where this project came from, and frame it a little bit. So the overall goal was to basically look at how anxiety fluctuated across different learning environments. When I started, it was only classroom versus VR, but this was conducted during COVID. So obviously Zoom was added as a learning environment. And then look at how lower anxiety actually improves speaking in terms of pronunciation, fluency, and also like complexity of discourse. So let's define virtual reality before we actually look at vTime, so we can make sure, like I said, we're all on the same page. So there's 2 types of VR. I mean, people define it in all different ways, but a common distinction is like low immersion and high immersion VR. And low immersion is things like, again, Second Life is definitely the environment that most call research has been conducted on in terms of low immersion VR. And these are basically, again, virtual worlds and spaces that can be accessed via like a desktop computer. Versus high immersion VR, the idea is that students join these environments using a headset. So here you can see the Meta Quest 2. And they're fully like physically, quote unquote, immersed in this space. So that's kind of the distinction. And I was looking specifically at like high immersion virtual reality versus like the low immersion VR, low immersion virtual worlds. And then within the high immersion VR, you have kind of like a spectrum. Okay. So you have like really inexpensive devices that honestly aren't that immersive. So things like Google Cardboard. And then you can go all the way up to like a really expensive device that's very immersive that needs to be tethered to like a high power computer. Or you could also put like the new Meta Quest Pro in this category. which is like, $1,500. Right now, the majority of the research I've been seeing at least is being conducted with the MetaQuest 2, or what used to be known as like the Oculus Quest 2, because these are standalone. They don't have to be tethered to a high power computer. They provide a really good experience, and they're relatively affordable, and I put that in quotations, compared to these devices. So this is right around $399. So you can see it's right in the middle there. And then with these devices, you can do different types of things. You can't necessarily do all these with Google Cardboard, but if you have like the MetaQuest 2, you can like simply have students like view 360 media and content. I've seen a lot of projects doing that. You can also have them, like I said earlier, with Immerse Me, like interact with like human to computer interaction. And then you can also have them in environments like Immerse, AltSpace, Spatial, etc., where they can actually interact with each other and with their teacher. So that was also my main focus of this research, is I wanted my students to be able to have real-time social interactions with each other versus like a computer. Any questions before I dive into what vTime is?
So far, we're good.
Okay, thank you. So what is vTimeXR? I'm going to give a little caveat. vTime has its benefits and strengths, but when I started this project back in like 2019, it was kind of the best option available to me at the time. So I'll talk about its downsides later, but what is it? It's a social VR platform. So it's designed like really for bringing people together in different locations and just having them speak. So it was ideal for my research because I was looking at like speaking skills and conversation. It's also compatible across a ton of different devices, which is something I really liked. Some VR platforms, you have to have like a specific headset, but vTime was compatible with the Oculus Go, which is what I was using in this study at the time. And then it's also free. So that was a big selling point. It also has an extensive tutorial when students like set up their accounts and create their avatars. It walks them through how to use the platform, how to create an avatar, all of that really well, which is important when it comes to like training. And then you could also customize the avatars. And this was really important to me because I was looking at like, how is anxiety impacted by these avatars? So I wanted students to have the ability to really either customize them to look like themselves or customize them to look like someone completely different. And then in terms of kind of like the way the app works, like I said, it's a social environment. So you can have up to 4 users together at a time. So it kind of works like little breakout rooms actually, where like I put them in groups of 3. And then as the teacher, I could hop between the different groups. They are private environments in the sense that people have to ask to join. So that was another thing that was really important to me, is I didn't want random people just like interrupting my students, like can happen on some other social platforms. And then you also have over 25 different locations to choose from. And you can also bring in like 360 images and other files as well. So you can kind of customize it in that way. And so what I have here is a little demo. I'm actually going to talk over this because you can't hear me talking in it, but it's just to give you an idea of what it looks like. I find that with VR, it's hard to imagine what something looks like just from images. So what you're seeing here is I'm in like the study space, which is like the home space that it takes you to, with someone else who's helping me record the demo. And across the top, students have different like tabs they can go through. So they can like go to different theaters, go to different destinations, change their avatar. They can take like pictures together. When they go to, this catch up to us. When they go to the different destinations, you can see the options kind of across the top here. So they have some that are like really traditional, like a boardroom, and then they have some that are like you're on the edge of a cliff. So it really depends on kind of what you're doing, what would make sense. Like I said, there's also different theaters they can go to and watch like either video clips together. So what you're going to see is I'm actually taking me and the other person I was with to this one theater. And then now we could put up like a video on the screen over here and play it. They do have like preloaded videos in there. It's very soccer based for some reason. or at the time it was. This might have changed since then. And then here, I think I just take you to another one so you can see this is the boardroom. This is one of the environments the students used in this study. And in this space, they can actually put up like a picture or an image onto the screen, which you'll see right over here. So what I was able to do with my students is actually import an image of like the task instructions and then put it up on the screen so that they could see it in VR and they weren't having to like lift their headset up and constantly. You can also include 360 images, and the way that that works, you'll see as soon as it loads, is it just kind of places you in the image and then you're kind of floating there. So that's a good way of like being able to bring in if you have like a specific location. Here we have like some like famous church or cathedral that students could talk about. And then I want to be mindful of time. Oh, I think this froze too. Yes, it's freezing. Well, that's the main thing. I think the video shows you like a couple more environments, but y'all get the idea. Let me just see if it'll let me advance past this. I might have to restart my PowerPoint. Hold on, let me stop sharing for 1 second and get this up and running.
Take your time.
My computer did not like the VR video. Okay, hold on. 1 second. Okay. Get back to where we were. Okay, y'all can see that? Cool.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So any questions? Sorry, let me back up. Are there any questions on vTime before I move on to talking about how it was used?
We don't have any questions on vTime. Just wanted to make a very quick comment. I've used it quite a bit because of the workshop I took with you. And it's true that the video doesn't do justice to how immersive even that library is. It's very bright, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Hear the fire crackle. So it's really a great experience.
Yeah, you can, thank you. I actually wanted to mention that. So all the locations have like sounds built in. So it is really immersive, and it's a shame because even videos, like I feel like they're a little better than showing just a still picture to someone, but it's really hard to like imagine what it's actually like being in there. But yeah, if you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. It's a solid platform. It has its strengths and weaknesses, but overall it's very good. So how was this used? Again, this was in like a very big research study, but again, I'm just going to boil it down to like what y'all need to kind of understand to be able to follow the presentation for the sake of time. So I use this with 76 like intermediate/advanced university level French learners from fall 2019 to fall 2021. The project evolved a bit as COVID evolved, as you can imagine, but they were all enrolled. All of these activities were integrated into this course on our campus designed to help them achieve advanced low actual oral proficiency. So it was a conversation course. So it really worked well, like having these activities integrated. They were able to be added like pretty seamlessly into their existing like syllabus. So what I did with each student is I loaned them an Oculus Go VR headset for them to use either, most of them used it from home because the bulk of this was done during COVID. So they could use it throughout the entire semester. And we didn't have to worry about any safety issues. That's what this image is here, is what the headset looks like. It looks dated compared to some of the newer headsets, but at the time, this was like the most affordable, highest quality, like standalone headset, again, that didn't have to be tethered to like a really high powered PC. So this is what we used, and vTime was available on it. And what students did is they worked in groups of 3 throughout the semester to complete what are called interpersonal consensus building tasks. And I'll show you what those look like in just a second. And they worked in vTime. And then at the end of the entire like study or semester, Interviews were also conducted to kind of gather their feedback. So what did they like? What did they not like? And that's what I'll be presenting, the data I'll be presenting for y'all today. But what is a consensus building activity? So it's essentially a speaking activity that's designed so students have to like work together to reach an agreement, right? To come to a consensus. And so I created 7 different activities that created back to that related back to the themes that were being covered in their course at the time. So one was on like YouTube content creators, because they were talking about like the youth and like what's trendy. One was on like science and technology. We had one on sustainability and like environmental issues and so on and so forth. And you can see in terms of like integrating them into the class, this is just an excerpt of their syllabus. I'm sorry, it's in French, but I'll walk you through it. Here you have like the different weeks, the different days. And what you can see is over here, they had different themes that they were basically covering all semester. And each theme took about 2 weeks, give or take. And within that 2-week period, we would have like a VR session where we were doing the activity covering this theme. So that's kind of how we like integrated it into the class. And they normally had like, at least an introduction or two to the theme before we actually did the speaking activity in VR. For the different tasks, I won't read through all of this for the sake of time, but again, I will give you access to all the tasks, so you'll have them. Here is the themes, and then you can see kind of the main objective that they were working towards in this 3rd column here. And then each student was assigned a different role that they had to play. So for example, like, and they were like, there was a hierarchical order to them. So like, for example, for the social media task, they had to come up with a new idea for Meta, for a new type of social like network. One of them was playing Mark Zuckerberg, one of them was playing like, a long time worker at Facebook, and one was playing an intern. And they all had different goals that they were trying to accomplish that were at odds with each other. So they had to navigate that throughout the class time and basically come to an agreement that suited them all. And like I said, they all had different things they were trying to accomplish that I intentionally made difficult for them to be able to reconcile them, so that they would have to have a lot of negotiation and meeting. And then over in this last column, you can see like the vTime destination that was used. And I basically picked one that related back to the task in the best way possible. So like for this one, since it was like a meeting at Facebook, they met in like the boardroom. Or like for the one on sustainability, they met in like the Japanese gardens, because I want them to be in like an outdoor location since they were talking about the environment. So that's a little bit how the tasks were like set up. And here you can see a little bit more in detail, like how each one specifically worked. So they received task instructions for each one. And then they also like were each assigned the role, like I mentioned, and they received specific instructions on that role, telling them like, this is what you want to accomplish in the conversation. And so that's what you can see on the side here. So like this was the education role, or sorry, the education activity, and they basically had to come to an agreement on like how to handle budget cuts in their school system. So one of them was playing like the director of the school, who had like his or her own ideas. One of them was playing like a teacher, and one was playing like the student representative. And they had to, again, negotiate throughout that amount of time to come up with a solution that they all liked. And then at the end of class, we obviously like went over them and all of that. So what did students think about it? They had both positive and negative feedback, as you can imagine. In terms of positive feedback, they did find it to be really immersive. And this was even more important to them as COVID went on. Like the fact that it really made them feel like they were physically together was a huge thing that was important to them when we were all like, quarantining and originally very, very isolated. So they found it shockingly immersive. They enjoyed actually talking to people. I'm not going to read all these quotes again for the sake of time, but they really liked that they could participate from home because they felt most comfortable there. And a lot of them felt like, it's cool, fun, the things that they like about VR. But they did say the graphics looked believable and the sounds made me feel like I actually left my room. And then they mentioned too, like it did feel really real because you could move around. And as you turn your head, if you've ever been in VR, you know that the environment moves around with you. So that was very convincing to them, even though the environments were obviously like very cartoonish, as this participant mentions here. And they said, you know, the fact that you could hear the people speaking there too, and there was noise, like background noise, that felt really real as well. I do want to know these are all pseudonyms, of course. These aren't these students' real names. They also found it really interactive, which was surprising to me because vTime is actually, one of my critiques of it is it's actually not that interactive of a platform compared to some of the VR possibilities we have now. At the time, again, it was like the best thing available for what I was looking for, but now we have a bunch of VR environments so students can go in and like actually interact with objects and interact with the space itself. vTime, they're really just like sitting there. But they still found that it was, you know, exciting, interesting. They liked all the different backgrounds or the different scenarios, and that it was kind of like a nice twist, especially for those who were doing classes on Zoom. And then this student was commenting on like, it did feel a lot more interactive, having to put on the VR headset and then choosing different locations each time was pretty cool. They also found that being in a contextually relevant environment was really helpful for their learning. So we had one student who was saying like, you know, for my 7th year learning French, I've been learning French in dim lighting and windowless rooms because it's a very school environment. I don't know really how to speak French in a setting that doesn't include whiteboards, blackboards, and I think that's probably an issue for when I go to France. And then, so this, sorry, let me back up. This was something that a lot of students talked about, was the fact that like, when you're in VR, you can't really see it in this quote, but when you're in VR, like you have to really just rely on what you know. You know, there was no dictionary in this app. There was no way for them to really look back at notes. They had to just like speak as if they would if they were actually in France or in a real immersive situation. And then a lot of students know too that like they felt the environments added to the task. And one student gave the example of when they were talking about sustainability and stuff like that, she looked around at the water and was like, oh, water, it helped almost aid me in thinking of ideas. So that was, they found that really useful as well when they were trying to come up with solutions, that they were surrounded by this environment that was contextualized. And then in terms of their avatars, so my study again was looking at anxiety, but they also did like that the avatars actually represented themselves and the other students because it was easier to recognize them. And they mentioned that, you know, it's better than other VR platforms where if they had chosen, I don't know, like a duck, or in other VR platforms where the avatars are more generic. So they did really like that they were able to customize them to really look like each other, and then they could recognize each other in VR. They also mentioned that they were more relaxed, some of them because of the use of avatars, but also just because it was, you know, less of a formal classroom setting. One student said, just sitting in a chair at home, not thinking about anything else. I think it was immersive enough that in general, I wasn't doing the same things that I would have done in person. I was sitting normally, talking with my hands normally, even if they couldn't see anything. So they did like that they were represented by the avatars. And they also found that, and this was actually surprising for me, because if you've ever used VR with students, sometimes it can be a bit chaotic at the beginning, but they actually felt that it was less distracting than the classroom or like when they were on Zoom. And one participant mentioned that it just cut out a lot of the distractions that weren't part of the VR atmosphere. So I think that that really helped. When you're doing the VR thing, that really helped because I couldn't do anything else. It really helped to just cut all that way away so that I couldn't really think about that right now. And I could just focus on the French. Several participants compared it back to Zoom when like you have all your notifications popping up on your screen, which might be the case right now for some of you, you know, so they liked that they were like in VR, they weren't being bombarded by anything else. Though I will say that I think Meta changed their settings and now you can get notifications from Facebook and stuff if you enable that. In terms of negative student feedback, so I've kind of broken it into 2 categories. Some that's just negative feedback on vTime and some that's negative feedback on VR in general. So vTime, one of the things that's really a drawback for it is like you are stationary. So when you come in, you're just sitting in, your little circle of 4. And that was something that a lot of participants commented on, and the fact that, it is an advantage because you're focused on talking, but you can't get up and like explore the scene. The reason that I did find it beneficial for this project is none of the students had motion sickness. And I think a lot of that was because they can't walk around. Sometimes when people like walk around in VR apps, they do get motion sick. And since this was like part of a class, I really wanted to be extra mindful of that. But I did have one student even compare it to sleep paralysis and say like she was confined to this avatar. She really didn't like it. And that same student also commented on the fact that because we were using the Oculus Go, they didn't have the hand tracking. And so they couldn't actually gesture. So their hands would move kind of like automatically, robotically, but they couldn't actually like have, gestures and all of that they could in more advanced VR headsets like we have now. So that was something that especially this student commented on, like she felt like part of her communication was cut off because especially like with French, she uses her hands to get like her ideas across sometimes. And then in terms of connecting with others, this is where the vTime platform, just from like a usability standpoint, was confusing with them. For them, they felt like it was confusing sometimes to like connect with their peers that were supposed to be in their group or figure out how to join them. And we did have one instance where someone accidentally like let someone into their room. So that's what you can see they're talking about here. This person joined, they happen to have the same name as someone else in the class. And they ended up joining our group. I let them in and they didn't say anything. We couldn't figure out how to get rid of them, but their character was doing all these weird hand movements and stuff. And it was just kind of creepy because I didn't know who this stranger was in the game. So yeah, even though vTime is relatively private, that still ended up happening like occasionally, and the students did not enjoy it. And then in terms of just negative feedback on like VR was, again, here we have a student saying, with VR, she didn't want to have to take off the headset to look up vocabulary words. So that kind of did stress her out because she had no aid and just had to speak. Again, I think that's a good thing because it makes them practice what they really know, but it was a little anxiety inducing for them. And then a lot of students did not find it super glasses friendly. Some of the headsets will have like inserts that you can put in if you wear glasses, but depending on the type of glasses you have, it still can be difficult to fit the VR headset over them. So that was feedback that was relatively common for my students that did wear glasses. And then one of them said that it put strain on their eyes and that it caused a slight headache. But surprisingly, no one was nauseous. And I do think that's because they were seated in vTime. In terms of setup, we had a lot of difficulties getting it connected, like the VR headsets connected specifically on dorm Wi-Fi because there were extra like security measures in place by the university. So that was frustrating for some students who were using it from their dorms. And then just the fact that like it is more to prepare than they're used to. So the student talks about that, saying like it's a little finicky to get everything set up. If you forget to charge it, like that's a problem. Versus like our laptops or phones, you could use a friend's device, but also I think we're just all so used to having those charged that we don't even think about it anymore. So yeah, it was just more upfront, more work upfront to be ready for class. And then some students, especially my students that didn't really struggle with foreign language anxiety, didn't like necessarily that they couldn't see each other. So the student said, I couldn't see my classmates, I could just hear them. The avatars helped to recreate that there was a person, but it didn't feel the same. And then one of my students mentioned that, it was difficult because you couldn't tell when people wanted to talk. So when you're trying to have like turn taking in a conversation, it ended up stressing her out a little bit because she felt like she needed to kind of monitor the conversation and felt insecure not knowing when she should jump in. I will say this student was also a language teacher though. So I think part of it came from her background and just how used to doing that she is in her own classroom. So really quickly, let me just check the time. Okay, we're good. Really quickly, I want to talk about lessons learned. in the hope that, if you're trying to use VR for the first time, you can avoid some of the difficulties I had. So yes.
Can we do just a couple questions?
Yeah.
We had somebody ask whether students got dizzy at all. Did they get nauseous? Did you have any issues?
No, but again, I really think that's because in the app, they were seated. So again, I mean, that's something that can be critiqued about vTime, but I also think it's a benefit. So no, I didn't have anyone who got nauseous. The only like negative physiological side effects were occasional like gas strain on the eyes, headaches. I also think with VR headsets, if you don't have them really, what would be the word? Like set up to where they'll be like aligned with your head, I guess. Like if you don't have your straps and everything perfect, they can cause a lot of that strain. And since students were doing this from home, I didn't have the ability to like go around and make sure that like, their straps were tight enough or that it was positioned perfectly. But yeah, that's a good question.
And did the VR sessions take place during class time?
Yeah. These were basically, they replaced class that day. So that's why it was really important that like the theme of the session aligned with the topic of the course. And since it was a conversation course, it worked well because, the whole goal of the course is to make them speak. So we were able to, the teacher of the course was comfortable with me like taking over, 12 of their sessions to do this throughout the semester.
So it was a conversation level college course, like a third-year course?
Yeah, second, third year.
Second, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So in terms of training, I really can't emphasize this enough. So I think where I see people go wrong, or where I've heard people go wrong with VR, is like thinking that because our students are young, they're just going to pick this up. Some will, but some won't. Like if you've never been in a VR headset, it's not necessarily super intuitive the first time. So you definitely want to make sure, that you're super trained on it so that you can walk someone else through how to do it. But allow plenty of time for training. So I actually dedicated 2 full class periods to training because initially when I was starting out, I dedicated 1 and it just wasn't enough time. So we did 2 full class periods on training. And then one thing that's really important when you are training is to take advantage of the cast feature in the VR headset. So that's basically when you have the VR on, you can click cast and then you can show what you're doing on another screen. Because if you're trying to walk someone through VR or show them what they should be seeing in VR, it's really hard when you can't see what they see and they can't see what you see. So this is something that you will definitely want to do. And then with the newer headsets, when we're training people now, is we'll train them, how to use the headset, how to use the specific apps, but we'll also have them use an app called First Steps. And I'm going to put that in the chat if it will let me. I'm not sure with the webinar, but it's just an app that comes on any of the Quest headsets. That also the purpose of it is to train people to use VR. So yeah, definitely allow plenty of time for training. In terms of equipment and classroom setup, so setting it all up can take a lot of time if you have people doing this, like, if you're setting up multiple headsets at once. So definitely, make sure everything's fully charged, make sure, like, triple check that it's connected to Wi-Fi, because on school, like universities, you can connect it. And then with the university, like security features, it might disconnect you. So definitely check right before that it is actually connected to the Wi-Fi. And then one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of like managing a lot of headsets is ArborXR. So ArborXR is like a platform on the computer that you can use to manage your VR devices. It's free if you have so you can see that here, if you have up to 50 devices. So I have like a free account. And the way it works is when you set up your headset, you then sync it to your ArborXR account, and then you can use this to update any apps, to add any apps to the headset, to do any like system updates, to check the Wi-Fi. You can also check like, are any of these devices out of date? Do they need any updates? You can also control what students can access within the headset. So right now I'm working on a project where we're going to be using VR with like high schoolers. So obviously the school is like, well, how do we make sure that these students aren't doing something in the headset they shouldn't be? So basically you can use this to completely lock everything down, and only give them access to like 1 or 2 apps if that's what you want to do. But even more importantly, I think just in terms of like keeping everything updated and like pushing different apps out, this can save you like, I mean, potentially hundreds of hours of work. So it's something I've recently found and highly, highly recommend in terms of like setting up the equipment. In terms of the classroom, if you have students doing VR in the classroom, make sure they're seated. Don't have them like, because you have the option to stand and obviously like walk. You want to make sure they're seated far enough apart that they're not going to be like hitting each other when they're moving their hands. And then obviously privacy and safety features. So I really tried again to find like an app that was social and let students be together, but was still private. Some apps now you can create like separate private spaces, but y'all saw with vTime, we still had like a couple instances where students would actually accidentally let like a stranger in. So it's just things that you really want to be mindful of and talk to your students about, and like just be careful when you're picking your apps and look out for that. Because you can find some weird people in VR just like you can anywhere else on the internet. In terms of getting VR headsets, this is a question I get a lot, so I wanted to talk about it. So you don't have to necessarily buy like 30 VR headsets to get started. Actually, I would advise against it if you've never actually worked with VR, because it can get overwhelming really quickly. And also these headsets go out of date relatively fast. I mean, like I got a bunch of goes for this project, and that was only a few years ago, and they're already kind of like obsolete. Like you can only do a few things on them to this day. So I would consider just trying to get a set of like even 2 headsets. And there's a lot of activities you can do with students that are, they're working in a group and maybe one person is in a headset screencasting and the rest are kind of helping them from the outside. But you can definitely get creative in that way so that you don't have to buy like an entire set of VR devices. There's also a lot of companies like Meta, for example, who are giving away headsets to be used, especially in K through 12 education, specifically high schools, because that's something that they're really advocating for right now. So definitely look out for those, apply for them. I mean, we got a set of 500 Quest 2s through a project like that, just because they wanted to get these VR devices into schools, and we only applied for 50. So they're very eager to get these out. So definitely look at that. And, you know, if you're on a campus, there are a lot of VR labs now that are popping up, but also a lot of like technology centers on campus or libraries will have loanable headsets that students can check out. So that's what I did the first time I was ever starting with VR. And then in terms of like campuses, a lot of engineering departments have a lot of VR devices, and you'd be surprised at how willing they are to let you borrow them if you go and talk to them. I think a lot of times they don't think of us in the languages when they're like distributing this equipment. So definitely reach out to people. There's probably more VR headsets on your campus than you think. And then worst comes to worst, you can always use like the cheaper VR devices like Google Cardboard, or you could just access a lot of these spaces through like student cell phones or through a desktop computer. So obviously it wouldn't be as immersive, but you could still do a lot of interesting activities with them. And then I think on that note, here is, if you scan this QR code, and I'm going to put the link in the chat as well. Let me just grab that. Or can I share links in the chat, Edwige?
Yes, just make sure when you type in the chat that you're responding to everybody, not just the
okay. So it's giving me the option of host and panelist, and then you and Chris.
You don't have the option to email everybody?
No, but here, if you don't mind popping it over.
No, yeah, I got it.
I'll put it in there. And then, like I said, y'all could also scan the QR code, but I'll show you kind of what that looks like. So at the top here, you have a link to all the consensus building activities. And then down here, you just have like a running list of, like I said, different articles and resources, a lot of like FLT mag articles that talk, like give really practical examples of how VR was used versus like more theoretical research articles. And that is it. So I think we have like 15 minutes left for Q&A.
Perfect. We have a few questions.
Perfect.
I want to go back. Somebody early on asked a question about an app called Wanda, I think.
Wanda. I do not know Wanda. I know Wander.
Yeah, I know Wonder too.
Yeah.
But,
actually, yeah, I don't know what Wanda.
And let's, yeah, Wanda VR.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I'm gonna look into it now, but yeah, I don't know.
I was going back to the checking that I was reading it right. Okay. Here's an interesting question. Since students had different roles and it was mentioned that they were sort of hierarchical, was there any way to control for a balanced amount of speaking moments amongst learners? And similarly, would students get distracted from the conversation or goal due to the VR setting itself?
Those are two great questions. So in terms of the first one, originally when I did like my pilot study, the roles were not hierarchical. Like they were just like, they were more equal. And one of my committee members on my dissertation, since I was looking at anxiety, was like, no, you should really like make these to where you have someone who's like higher up in the organization, someone who's lower in the organization, to see if that has any impact on their anxiety and how they're performing the task. And so at the end of each task, I didn't talk about this, but at the end of each task, basically students filled out like a questionnaire where that was targeting like their anxiety during the task itself. But one of the questions was also, did the role that you play impact, like, I think we asked about anxiety, but we also asked about like how comfortable they felt like contributing their ideas. There were a couple of questions, but they were essentially trying to get at like, did you participate less because you had like a lower role, or did you like dominate the conversation because you had a lower role? And shockingly, everyone said no the entire time. And then when I was watching all the video data, I actually didn't see that like appearing at all. I did see, of course, when you would have students who were just naturally quieter versus ones that were just naturally more outspoken, obviously there was some difference there. But in terms of the roles themselves, it didn't actually seem to impact like how much they were speaking, which was surprising. We were kind of hoping it would. And then in terms of would students get distracted from the conversation of goal due to the VR setting itself? Occasionally, like, because again, I watched all their videos, occasionally like you would have, especially at the beginning when they first go in, there might be like a minute or two where they're like, joking around and just kind of talking about the setting and not paying attention. But for the most part, I think because we did have those 2 training sessions, and within that, I like budgeted time for like just playing around in vTime, they were actually pretty focused during the class. And they also knew that everything was being recorded for the research side of things. And so that might have helped, or I'm assuming that helped as well, keep them kind of on task.
Thank you. Here's another question about assessment. Did you assess the consensus building activities? If yes, how did you do that?
Hold on, let me scroll down. Sorry, will you repeat that? I can't find it, and I was drinking, so I heard like half of it.
Did you ever assess the consensus building activities? And if yes, how did you assess them?
Yes, this is a very, you're opening a can of worms with this question. It has a long answer. Yes, basically, to keep it brief, I ended up transcribing all of their conversations verbatim and then classifying them using an interaction analysis model that essentially breaks down speech into like different levels ranging from less complex to more complex. And then all their conversations were coded so that I could see like in this consensus building activity, they were, speaking at higher levels of discourse or whatever. And then like in this environment, they were doing X, Y, and Z. So yes, they were assessed, but it was a very, very long, tedious process. And if you want to email me, I am happy to send you all the information of that, because it's a massive part of the project that is kind of hard to condense down into a little response.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about the anxiety study. And so Erin would like to know whether you've done the study looking at the physiological responses. Were you able to determine that the students' foreign language anxiety or anxiety was reduced? And then there's a similar question asking, were you able to compare the levels of anxiety in the classroom and in the VR environment?
Yeah, those are great questions. And like I said, if y'all want like the actual data and stuff, I'm happy to share it. If you want to email me afterwards, I can send you like the articles and stuff that talk about that. But yes, that was the main focus of this project. So I looked at their self-reported anxiety, their heart rate, and their salivary cortisol for a subset of participants. I didn't look at everyone's salivary cortisol because it's kind of expensive to measure. And also once COVID hit, the university was like, you're not taking saliva samples, as you can imagine. But I looked at those across the different environments and compared them and found that students did have lower cortisol levels in VR compared to the classroom, substantially so. And this was particularly the case for students who had high foreign language anxiety to begin with. In terms of the self-reported anxiety, high anxiety students, so again, those students that struggle with foreign language anxiety did report lower anxiety in VR compared to like the classroom and Zoom. And then in terms of the heart rate data, we saw a similar pattern. So especially for those students who had high anxiety, their heart rate was lower in VR. So their baseline and then was lower in VR compared to like the classroom and on Zoom. And then their heart rate also decreased in the VR task compared from the baseline compared to like in the classroom where we saw it peaking a lot with their interactions. So yes, we did analyze that data. And we did find that VR was beneficial in terms of like both the self-reported and both the physiological anxiety.
Great.
And yeah, I do have like that is all written up in a couple different places. So if you're interested in more, I'm happy to show that or to send you that.
Awesome. I think what we'll do is we'll combine the articles, the slides, and the recording, and I'll send an email with all this information.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
We have probably time for a couple more questions if you're up for it, Tricia. Here's a question on the impact of using VR on improving conversation skills.
Yes. Another good question, Erin. Yes, there's the data. You'll see that as well. So I looked at, in terms of their speaking, I looked at their comprehensibility, intelligibility, and fluency. And then I also looked at, like I said, when we were coding using that interaction analysis model, I also looked to see if like they were speaking at higher levels of discourse and having more complex conversations in VR compared to the other environments. And yes, we found that they were more comprehensible, more intelligible, and have more complex conversations in VR compared to Zoom in the classroom.
Awesome. Here we have a question on feedback. What's your experience like in terms of providing feedback, positive and negative points compared to the typical breakout room setup on Zoom?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Do they make feedback to the students during class time or feedback to the students like in terms of grading?
Yeah, I think it's feedback to the students while
during class time.
Yeah. Environment, I think.
Okay. So yeah, what I did, so since this was a research study, the point was for them to really interact, and I was more like observing and hopping in when they had questions or like issues. So I wasn't necessarily giving them a lot of feedback on the spot. It was much more a time when like they were able to do this activity on their own and see if they could get through it in French. In terms of giving, feedback compared to the breakout room set up on Zoom, honestly, it was pretty comparable. Because it worked in the same way. I had students in groups of 3, and I could see them all in vTime, like their little groups kind of floating around. Like you can see on Zoom where you see the different breakout rooms, and then I would just hop in listen, observe a little bit, give them feedback if necessary, to keep them moving. Maybe the one kind of negative point about it is when you pop in on VR, like they see your avatar. So it's like on Zoom, I feel like when you pop in, I guess they see your camera, but if you have like your camera off or something, it feels less intrusive, versus like on VR, like they definitely knew I was observing them. Like I popped into their conversation and they could see me. So that was maybe the only difference. But other than that, it was pretty much the same, I would say.
Awesome. Did students work with the same partners throughout the semester?
That's an awesome question. We tried to keep them with the same partners as much as possible because and I see you have a question below that, America, as well, so I'll answer that at the same time. But yes, we tried to keep them with the same partners, but because this was integrated into a course, obviously if students were like absent, they would miss that day. So sometimes groups would be a little tweaked because of that, but the goal was to keep them together. And then in terms of deciding how to make the groups, I did it based on their initial. So when we started the study, they all filled out like a baseline foreign language anxiety questionnaire. And then I classified them into like 3 different groups: high, like foreign language anxiety and high social anxiety, low foreign language anxiety and low social anxiety, and then like high foreign language anxiety, but low social anxiety. So they were kind of like on a spectrum. And then we formed the groups based on that as much as possible. So we would try to have like a mixture. So we didn't have like all really high anxiety students in a group. But again, especially during COVID, I mean, one of the classes that this was integrated into had 5 students. So we kind of just had to make the groups like based on what happened. I also see a question about what did the instructor think of the VR use? The instructor liked it. I was the one who like integrated the VR. So the instructor actually like took the day off when I was doing these VR activities with the students and I was playing the role of the instructor. So they enjoyed it because they got, a day off from teaching. But they also did think it was like, beneficial and interesting for their students.
Awesome. I'm going back up. I know I missed a couple questions. Okay, somebody's asking, Christine is asking, how much interaction is there with native speakers in the target language in vTime?
So in this study, the students were interacting with each other. But VR or vTime, it is like a social platform. So technically you could go in there and find people from anywhere. I will say I haven't like met a lot of native French speakers in vTime. I've met more of them in alt space. There actually used to be like quite a few in there. But vTime does have this interesting feature where students can like set their language. And so you can select all the languages you speak. And so everyone can do that. So that could be a way of like looking for people, but it's different than some other like social VR platforms where like you can go in this giant space and you see everyone, you can kind of walk around and just meet people. vTime, like you have to click on someone and like invite them to join you, which was a good way to add like a little bit more privacy for this study, but they'd have to actively like see someone and be like, okay, I think that might be a native speaker, and then invite them to the conversation, if that makes sense. And I think I saw a follow-up question from one saying assessment was not part of the course grade, right? These activities, they were just graded on participation. So if they came and they participated, they got all the points.
Nice. I'm going to jump in. I have a couple questions for you. How long did they spend in VR? I can't, maybe you mentioned that, but, or maybe I missed it. How long were the sessions?
So the sessions were right around ideally 30 minutes because the class was a 50-minute class, but we wanted to allow, like 10 minutes for everyone to kind of get in and get connected in case someone forgot to like charge their headset. They kind of gave us a buffer, and then 10 minutes at the end of class to kind of like debrief all together.
Okay.
And I think the 30-minute mark was good. I think if I kept them in there longer, we might have had some more negative side effects.
Yes, I agree. I feel like 30 minutes at a clip, or if you're going to be in there longer, you need a little break.
Yeah.
If you were to redo this project today, what app would you use?
So I would use Immerse. And I'm not just saying that because I work for them. I'm saying that because when like I said, when I was coming up with this study, I really wanted something where they could interact with each other that was private enough. So I didn't want to use like VR chat or anything because at the time it was very overwhelming. But I really wish they could have interacted with like objects in the environment itself. So that's honestly the app I would use. And I really do promise I'm not just saying that because I work for them.
And one last question from Karen Decker, our company president here. She's asking, do you think the feedback will be different or would be different now that students are back in the classroom and they are not feeling so isolated as they did when using this during COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question because that's something that I did see. So for the students who had like low foreign language anxiety, who like weren't anxious at all and didn't really care about being in person or online, they actually really were excited to be back in the classroom and preferred it for that reason. And a lot of them said in their interviews, like, hey, COVID made me like really appreciate like in-person learning a lot more. For the students who struggled with foreign language anxiety, they like actually still preferred the VR environment. So yeah, it kind of depended on like their own anxiety profile.
All right. There's one last question. I'm sorry. I was
You're fine.
we're done, but it's a really good question. Why do you think the students felt less anxiety on VR than Zoom? The only difference between VR and Zoom that could impact anxiety that I can think of the top of my head is that maybe they could hide behind their avatars.
Yeah. So I think the avatars was a huge portion. I had one student who was commenting on like it was really interesting. She commented on like the different degrees of how people perceive you in VR. So in the person where you can see everything versus Zoom where you can see the top half versus in VR where you can only see like the avatar. And then I also think a lot of them mentioned like it was more game-like, and even though they weren't actually playing a game at all, but I think because it was like cartoonish, they felt like it was more of a game and it helped in that sense as well. But yeah, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is it. It's been great, a very informative talk.
Awesome, thank you.
So thank you for joining us. I will collect all the resources, and when the recording is done processing, I will email it to everybody who registered for the talk. So thank you,
Awesome.
everybody, for coming today. I really
thank you.
And yeah, have a great weekend and a great long weekend if you're off on Monday.
Awesome. Thank you. I have to hop to an interview. But I really appreciate this, Edwige. It was awesome.
Great. Thank you so much for coming.
And
Bye.
I'll follow up with all the resources.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.